Revelatory cosmology overthrows Big Bang cosmology as thoroughly as the heliocentric universe overthrew the geocentric one in 1610. Revelatory and modern cosmology are slightly related because they both begin about a century ago. Modern cosmology didn't exist before 1924 when Hubble discovered that spiral nebulae like Andromeda are actually distant galaxies. Before this, people were only certain that the Milky Way galaxy existed. The fifth epochal revelation began around the same time, around 1925, from the historical records. And in 1929, things really got going when Hubble discovered that galactic redshifts increase in proportion with the distance. This redshift distance relation was interpreted as a velocity distance relation. This interpretation supported the secular scientific cosmology of a Big Bang. The religious scientific cosmology of revelation proposes a universe revolving around God on paradise. So recent findings show the universe is static and not expanding, as Revelation asserted a century ago. And modern cosmology asserts that galaxies are randomly scattered on large cosmic scales, but there is evidence now of two concentrically arranged space levels, which were described by Revelation. There is also evidence of revolution of one of these space levels around paradise. So the body of evidence now available supports revelatory cosmology, and this evidence is proof that revelation is revelation, to use a phrase from the book. The velocity distance interpretation of the redshift distance relation was proposed by Hubble. He found that the ratio of galactic redshifts and distances equals a constant. From this, he inferred a velocity distance relation, since velocity equals the speed of light times redshift, which is just a ratio. So the velocity over the distance equals a constant known as the Hubble constant. So from this velocity distance relation, astronomers almost immediately went to a space expansion explanation for this relationship. This velocity distance relation is the principal evidence for the expanding universe model, which is the Big Bang model. Since this relation is true for all directions, it was concluded that we must be at the center of an expanding universe. And a solution to general relativity found in 1922 makes every location a center of space expansion. This non-Euclidean expanding universe model was adopted in the 1930s, except by a few astronomers like Hubble. By 1947, Hubble was openly concluding that space expansion is not real and does not cause receding velocities. He felt there must be a, quote, new principle of nature, which does not involve actual motion, end quote. Revelation agrees, asserting that galactic redshifts are primarily caused by time-space distortions. To quote from the book, this apparent speed of recession is not real. It results from numerous factors of error, embracing angles of observation and other time-space distortions. The phrase time-space distortions suggests a relativistic explanation for galactic redshifts. This is telling because prior to the development of relativity by Einstein, there was only Newton's absolute time and space, which are immutable. The gravitational redshift explanation for the redshift distance relation comes from a prediction of general relativity, which is that time slows down in a strong gravitational field. This slowing down of time or time dilation results in a lower frequency or redshift. So gravitational time dilation or redshift was confirmed both astronomically and terrestrially by 1959. Hubble's law, the velocity-distance relation, is linear in the expanding model. The redshift-distance relation is linear in the static model and can be explained by gravitational time dilation. This relation is caused by a difference in gravitational potential, which is what this formula shows. The point of this formula is to show that there is a clear definition of the redshift distance relation as opposed to a clear definition of the velocity distance relation in the Big Bang model. What the Hubble law is to the expanding model, this equation is to the static model. This equation works because of a uniform mass density and Newton's shell theorem. By this theorem, the distance r to a galaxy defines a sphere of matter with a gravitational potential. Gravitational redshift explains the linear redshift distance relation in a static universe model. So receding velocities are no longer needed to explain redshifts. So there's no longer a need for this non-Euclidean expanding universe model of the Big Bang. And this gravitational redshift explanation dovetails nicely with recent proof of a static universe. The reality of space expansion is unproven still after a century, and it has been debated ever since the 1930s. A test to confirm or refute the reality of space expansion is called the angular size redshift test. Prior angular size tests consistently favor a static universe model for redshifts up to 3 times the speed of light. The angular size of higher redshift galaxies should be much smaller in the static universe model, which is what this graph is attempting to show. The purple line is for the Big Bang universe, and you can see at a redshift of about 1.5, the size of galaxies stops getting smaller and starts getting larger. Whereas in the static universe model, it just consistently gets smaller. So the James Webb Telescope angular size test results from a 2022 study used high redshift galaxies with redshifts up to 15. In this log-log graph, the curve labeled with delta CTM predicts the angular size in the expanding model. Above a redshift of z equals 3, no galaxies are consistent with this prediction. The curve labeled TL for tired light predicts the angular size in the static model. This curve passes through the middle of all galaxies out to at least a redshift of 15. So the evidence matches the predicted sizes in a static universe, but not an expanding universe. So the conclusions reached by this and other tests is our analysis of JWST observations favors a static tired light model of the universe. JWST high redshift objects cannot be explained by the expanding universe model. The test also concludes the supposed 13.8 billion year age of the universe is too short. Quote, galaxies at redshifts greater than 15 discovered by JWST do not have enough time within the framework of the standard cosmological model to evolve into what is observed. Other studies of the JWST data find the number of galaxies in the universe, early universe, far exceeds the predictions of the expanding model. These other studies also show some of these early universes are impossibly massive. The space expansion model is incorrect, as Revelation asserted almost a century ago. These findings are consistent with an extremely old static modeled universe as described by Revelation. The confirmation of a static universe in which there is a viable explanation for the redshift distance relation that does not involve space expansion clears the way for revelatory cosmology. So the revelation of the master universe. The universe is not infinite, but its size is, quote, utterly beyond the grasp of finite imagination. The expanding model calculates the universe has a radius of about 46 billion light years. The findings in this paper suggest its radius may be on the order of quadrillions of light years. The location of paradise at the center of the universe makes this a religious cosmology by necessity. The space levels described as revolving around paradise are observable, which makes it a scientific cosmology. And we can conclude the deity must create the space levels, since no mindless physical laws can explain their formation or their alternating directions of revolution around paradise. The Isle of Paradise does not exist in space, but it does have a three-dimensional form of an ellipsoid. Quote, the eternal isle is elliptical in form, being 1/6 longer in the major north-south axis than in the minor east-west axis, and its thickness is 1/10 of the east-west diameter, end quote. These differences in dimensions and the outward cosmic force at the north end of the isle define absolute direction in the universe. Paradise is also the most gigantic organized body of cosmic reality in all the master universe. The transcendent presence of paradise in the universe is surrounded by relatively absolute midspace. The surfaces of paradise reflect the absolute divinity tension between the personal and the impersonal. The upper or personal spiritual plane of paradise has at its center the deity presence of the paradise trinity. This is surrounded by the most holy sphere and is reserved for worship and high spiritual attainment. The holy sphere surrounds, the holy area surrounds the most holy sphere and is divided into 7 concentric residential zones. The second of these residential zones is for natives of the superuniverses of time and space. Paradise is the absolute master pattern for universal material reality. The zone of infinity is at the center of nether paradise and the center of absolute gravity. Paradise is at the geographic center of infinity and the infinite extension of gravity. The space potency of the unqualified absolute is focalized on the nether surface. The universal circulation of cosmic force also occurs on the nether surface. The paradise is absolutely stationary at the center of the universe, and it's surrounded by 6 concentric space levels: the central universe of Havona, the superuniverse space level, and the 1st through 4th outer space levels. These form a plane of creation, and each successive space level is 100 times larger than the one it encompasses. So space levels revolve in alternating directions instead of all in one direction. The space levels are separated by buffer zones, each of which increases in width by 100 times, like the space levels. So the superuniverse space level is divided into 7 space segments, and the headquarters world at the center of each segment is halfway between the apex and the base, and halfway between the radial boundary lines, which converge on Paradise. Uversa is the headquarters world of the superuniverse of Orvonton. There is a distance r from Uversa to Paradise, and there is a shortest distance d from Uversa to a radial boundary line of Orvonton. The angle theta shown near Havona is 25.7 degrees, which is 1/14th of a complete circle. So by trigonometry, the distance r is 2.3 times the distance d. This is critical to scaling everything that follows. So the Milky Way is at the center of Orvonton, and everything in Orvonton orbits Uversa, or the Milky Way. The sun is about 200,000 light years from Uversa, which is relatively nearby, considering cosmic distances. In 1936, Hubble identified 9 galaxies that are bound to the Milky Way. These are noted in paper 15. He called these galaxies the local group. By 1955, the local group had a total of 22 definite members, extending out as far as 4.4 million light years. The 4 million light year radius of the local group is reliable, since it has been relatively constant for the last 70 years. The local group galaxies are all bound to the Milky Way, and everything that's bound to the Milky Way must travel with it as it orbits Paradise. So the radius of the local group is assumed to be the radius of Orvonton. So we know from the scale model that of the superuniverses that the distance to Paradise is 2.3 times the 4 million light year radius of Orvonton, or 9.2 million light years. And we also know that galaxies cluster around the superuniverse headquarters because galaxies in the other superuniverses orbit these headquarters. And this forms a continuous belt. So the local group should be contained in the central core, which is the name I've given this continuous belt of galaxies. And there are 2 absolute motions described in the superuniverse space level. The primary absolute motion of space respiration, which is represented by a red arrow pointing from Havona to the headquarters world of the first superuniverse, and the secondary absolute motion of the space level shown by the blue arrow, and which is just the orbital velocity. Space respiration is a velocity of space, and it occurs in 2 billion year cycles from just underneath Paradise. Pervaded space is currently in the middle of a 1 billion year expanding phase. Space respiration is not the idea of space expansion, which accelerates with distance. We know this because the Revelation has already said that the receding velocity of galaxies does not increase with distance. The accelerating expansion of space is rejected, and it's replaced by the uniform expansion of respiration. They say you fail to recognize the present outward and uniform expansion of the physical creations. Since the expansion of space respiration is not an acceleration, it can only be a uniform velocity. Therefore, there is an absolute velocity that we fail to recognize, but which we could recognize. To recognize an absolute velocity, we must first recognize an absolute frame of reference. There is a recognized universal rest frame in the expanding universe model that is virtually absolute. And we know absolute motion relative to paradise at the center of the universe is equivalent to motion relative to the universe as a whole. And a universal rest frame is established by the cosmic microwave background radiation. This was discovered in 1964, and it has a temperature of 2.725 degrees Kelvin, and it comes from every direction of the sky. This comes from a surface of blast scattering, according to the Big Bang Theory. Revelation says this radiation is due to gravity. But in the expanding model, it was emitted very shortly after a Big Bang, forming an expanding surface of blast scattering. This surface is virtually the same as the volume of the whole universe, and every location in the universe is at the center of this surface. This is possible in a non-Euclidean geometry. So a motion relative to a center of space expansion is an absolute motion in the rest frame of the whole universe. If the sun is at rest in this universal frame, the cosmic microwave background temperature would be the same in every direction. But the sun moves at 370 kilometers per second in this rest frame, causing this temperature to be highest in the direction of the CMB dipole. So the CMB dipole was identified in the 1960s, but the cause of the sun's motion is still not known. The only apparent explanation is gravitational attraction of large concentrations of mass. To explain this velocity, one of these masses must be the Shapley supercluster, 615 million light years distant. But a 2025 study finds a bulk flow of galaxies out to and beyond the Shapley concentration conflicts with the expanding model at 5 standard deviations. There is less than 1 chance in a million this hypothesis is correct. The sun's peculiar velocity in the CMB rest frame is not explained in the expanding model. In fact, it conflicts with it. The outward motion of space expansion is an absolute velocity that is potentially recognizable. The CMB dipole velocity is observed in the rest frame of the whole universe, making it the only virtually absolute motion which is recognized by us. Since there are no other virtually absolute velocities, it is reasonable to conclude that the CMB dipole is the absolute velocity of space respiration. The direction of the CMB dipole has been determined to be 168 degrees in equatorial longitude and -7 degrees in latitude. So the hypothesis, the working hypothesis, is that the CMB dipole points to space respiration occurring just underneath paradise. So the CMB dipole is shown pointing inward from Urantia to Paradise. Space respiration caused space to move outward from Paradise at 370 kilometers per second toward Urantia. If the sun is stationary relative to Paradise, it will appear to move at 370 kilometers per second toward Paradise. So the tension between absolute gravity and the conservation of angular momentum may keep the sun stationary relative to Paradise. This explanation is developed more in the paper. So with these parameters, the distance to Paradise is 9.2 million light years. So the superuniverse space level should be well within 32 million light years. A 2018 query of NASA's extragalactic database identifies 5,162 galaxies within 5 to 32 million light years. 3,700 of these galaxies are in a belt 75 degrees long by 10 degrees high, that is more or less aligned with the celestial equator. These galaxies were identified by the 2-degree field galactic redshift survey conducted around the turn of the century by the Australian Astronomical Observatory. So a query of all 2D FGRS galaxies in NASA's extragalactic database that are within 32 million light years finds 3,700 galaxies. Equatorial coordinates, spherical coordinates, can be converted into Cartesian coordinates and plotted on a plane. The CMB dipole is shown to the left of the Milky Way. The change in density from right to left appears to indicate the presence of the central core, something we talked about a few slides ago. The predicted borders of the central core can be found from the text. They can then be synchronized with this astronomic data. So to align the predicted central core with astronomical observations, we begin with the elliptical orbit of Urantia around Paradise, which is a 7/6 ellipse, where Urantia is 9.2 million light years from Paradise at a compass bearing of 135 degrees or southeast. To synchronize this ellipse with astronomic data, the plot needs to be centered on Urantia. But before replacing Paradise with Urantia, the direction from Paradise to Urantia needs to be rotated to be parallel to the CMB dipole after recentering. That's a little bit confusing, but essentially, if we rotate the whole ellipse 125 degrees counterclockwise, and then shift everything to the left so that Paradise is in the negative x, along a negative x line. Paradise now lies in the predicted direction of the CMB dipole at an equatorial longitude of 168 degrees. So putting all this together, the periphery of the superuniverse space level and the inner and outer borders of the central core are concentric ellipses. They are scaled to and concentric with Urantia's orbital ellipse, shown with 7 headquarters worlds. The direction to the center of the central core is based on the CMB dipole direction to Paradise. These ellipses can be rotated and shifted like Urantia's orbit to predict the form, position, size, and orientation of the central core. So the predicted borders of the central core can be overlaid with the 3,700 2D FGRS galaxies, the galactic density in the central core should then be higher than it is in the inner and outer zones. The galactic density at the location of each galaxy can be found by counting the number of galaxies in a cubic megaparsec centered on each galaxy. This is outlined in Appendix 2 to the paper. So filtering out galaxies where the density is below some minimum reveals where mass is concentrated. This is like taking an X-ray of an object to find where the mass density is greatest. Sort of like seeing the bone in an X-ray of a leg. So the predicted inner and outer borders of the central core are a remarkably good fit for a minimum density of 80 galaxies per megaparsec cubed. Over 2,400 out of a total of 3,700 galaxies are in locations with at least this density. Almost all of these 2,400 galaxies are contained within the predicted borders of the central core. There are almost no galaxies found outside the predicted central core at this galactic density. Details on how to replicate this finding are provided in Appendix 2 to this paper. There is also a good fit with the predicted periphery of the superuniverse space level at 20 galaxies per megaparsec cubed. The density increases from 20 in the outer zone to 80 galaxies per megaparsec cubed in the central core. The average galactic density beyond the periphery out to 32 million light years is 10.5 galaxies per megaparsec cubed. So the central core density is 7 to 8 times greater. This cosmic structure cannot be explained in the expanding universe model. It's not believable that anyone could have guessed the elliptical form, location, size, and orientation of this cosmic structure in 1955. The CMB dipole is evidence of the primary absolute motion of space respiration. There is evidence of the secondary absolute motion of revolution around paradise. A 2007 study found the Milky Way has a velocity of 259 kilometers per second towards an equatorial coordinate of 99.7 degrees longitude and 1.7 degrees latitude. This direction is aligned with the equatorial plane and perpendicular, more or less, to the direction to paradise. At this velocity, Uversa completes one revolution every 65 billion years. This seems like an excessively long period, except this period is consistent with the statement that there was a few billion light years it took for Uversa to move from the southern to the southeastern bend of the superuniverse space level. So having identified the superuniverse space level, the book makes predictions about the first outer space level. First of all, it's on the same plane as the superuniverse space level. And these two space levels are concentrically arranged around paradise. Its central core is, quote, a continuous belt of cosmic activity encircling the whole of the known, organized, and inhabited creation, end quote. It follows the pattern of our space level scaled up by a cosmic scale factor of 100. The distance to the middle of its central core should be 920 million light years, or 100 times the 9.2 million light years to Uversa in the superuniverse space level. This continuous belt encircling our space level is a clustering of at least 70,000 aggregations of matter, each of which is greater than any one of the present superuniverses. And there are at least 10,000 times as many galaxies in the first outer space level as there are in the 7 superuniverses, which is consistent with a 100-fold increase in its size. A very large cosmic structure consistent with this description was identified in 2003 in data released by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. The Sloan Great Wall, or SGW, was discovered by J. Richard Gott of Princeton University. It is a planar belt of galaxies, 1.4 billion light years long, that is aligned more or less with the equatorial plane. It spans 80 degrees of longitude and 10 degrees of latitude. It's the largest concentration of galaxies within 9 billion light years. It is far too large for the expanding model to explain. The Sloan Great Wall begins at 700 million light years and ends at 1,200 million light years, and it contains 28,000 galaxies. If this is extended from 80 degrees to 360, there are over 120,000 galaxies in this proposed structure. Median distance to the galaxies in this arc is 978 million light years, which is within 6% of the 920 million light years expected. The density of galaxies in the Sloan Great Wall is about 6 times greater than it is in surrounding space. The Sloan Great Wall is consistent with a segment of the central core of the first outer space level. It turns out that the Sloan Great Wall is part of a much larger structure discovered 6 years earlier in 1997 called the dominant supercluster plane. In 1997, Moret Ionesto identified 25 very rich superclusters within 1.6 billion light years. In a side view of these 25 superclusters, Ionesto found that 16 are located in a disk 3.2 billion light years in diameter and 450 million light years deep, shown by the solid black dots. She calls this disk-like concentration of superclusters the dominant supercluster plane. Ionesto found the probability of this arrangement of 16 superclusters occurring by chance is rejected at the 99% confidence level. Now, these 16 very rich superclusters in the dominant supercluster plane are aligned with the YZ plane in the supergalactic coordinate system. This is approximately aligned with the equatorial plane, like the Sloan Great Wall. The Vela, Virgo, Gamma, and Boots superclusters are parts of the Sloan Great Wall, as well as of the dominant supercluster plane. The Sloan Great Wall is consistent with an 80-degree segment of the central core of the first outer space level. This becomes apparent by extending the inner and outer boundaries of the Sloan Great Wall identified by Gott to form an annular structure. Doing this, we see that 2/3 of the superclusters are contained within this ring. The odds of this occurring by chance are 1 in 1,000. The density of able galaxy clusters in the central core of the first outer space level is 5 times the density in the inner and outer zones. This is comparable to the density differential of 4 times in the superuniverse space level. This ring of superclusters is consistent with the expected form, size, location, and density of the central core of the first outer space level. So the fifth epochal revelation usually initiates a millennium of cosmic enlightenment. That's their phrase. And this spiritual age begins with the revelation of Havona and Paradise. So Paradise is at the center of concentric space levels, which are perfectly unique to this cosmology. There's nothing like it in evolutionary thought. 2 space levels predicted by Revelation can now be clearly identified in the astronomical data. Their existence refutes the expanding universe model, since they cannot exist in this theory. Revelatory cosmology overthrows Big Bang cosmology as thoroughly as the heliocentric universe overthrew the geocentric one in 1610 with Galileo's discovery of the 4 moons of Jupiter. This analogy would actually be better if someone somehow predicted the existence of these 4 moons a century earlier, long before the invention of the telescope. A perfecter of wisdom says, we all know the direct course to pursue to find the universal Father. With this epochal revelation, all of mankind may now know the universe location of Paradise.
George, thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful talk. Very, very well researched and very thought-provoking. When you said Ernesto's predictions, it was saying that it was 99%, it could not be random. Okay, it absolutely could not be random. Was there an extension of that proposal besides just noting that it could not be random? Any sort of hypothesis about what is causing this non-randomness? Was there a comment by this person, or they just leave it open?
No, she's an astronomer at the Tartu University, and she just left it at that. She said, this is unusual, this high concentration of superclusters in this plane. And so is that, how likely is that? And she came up with the stat, but the problem with offering any kind of explanation for it would be that it totally violates the Big Bang theory. You can't have any structure that's 3 billion light years across in that model. So I've run across that a number of times in reviewing various studies, that people come right up to the line of saying, well, this seems to be in conflict with the Big Bang, but then they don't offer an alternative because they're afraid of being ostracized, like happened to Hal Arp and a few other astronomers who dared to step outside the box.
Right, right. Bob, go ahead. You are unmuted and ask your question.
Okay, thanks a bunch. George, I think you have the big kahuna here. This is a as you said on one of your first few slides, that this is a religious cosmology. If we look at about the whole picture of the way that the Revelation provides our cosmology, it coordinates science and religion through cosmology. There's a great paragraph that says that that's what has to happen. Okay, so let me build a little context here about the CMD dipole. It seems as though that the CMD dipole is a real conundrum for the expanding model, for conventional model. You treat it as a observational crack in the Big Bang framework that I think reveals a deeper geometry of this God-centered universe, paradise-centered, gravitational, revolving, and breathing universe that the revelation provides. You know, to me, those are the four things that that really place this whole cosmology into an entirely different realm, and it also coordinates, as you say, the religion with the cosmology. So you talked about the motion of the sun is crucial because it provides the single empirical trace that shows cosmic respiration. That said, as I understand it, I'm going to just build a little context and then give you a two-part question. The CMD dipole is new to this current presentation, as I understand it. It didn't appear in any of your other past presentations. It seems to me that the current folks, the scientists, astrophysicists, see this as a real conundrum. I've seen a few videos, YouTube videos, where either they tried to use this dipole situation, and let me explain what I think the dipole is. It's been found recently that the temperature of the universe is different opposite places. And there's not only a dipole, too, but there's also a quadrupole and an octupole. And I want to get to those in just a quick second, because what you did is you said that the CMB dipole points to paradise. Just a really amazing statement. The CMB, the cosmic microwave background radiation, has always been a real thorn in my side to try and understand it. But I think at least now I've got a better picture of this since you brought in the sun. And you brought in exactly what this is. So as I understand your position, you accept the measured direction and amplitude in the dipole, but you reject the assumption that it represents our motion through expanded space. So I assume that this relates to your concept of absolute extension, which I think is a really compelling idea. And I had to think about, what you meant by that. So what I want you to do is explain a little bit more about absolute extension. And if you could expand on what they're calling, what the astrophysicists are, now calling the axis of evil. And that's where the quadrupoles and the octupoles actually line up perfectly at a 23-degree angle, which is the exact angle of the actual tilt of the Earth. I mean, that's just mind-blowing just in itself. And am I correct that these alignments actually correspond to the same underlying structure that you described in the model?
I'm not sure. I didn't talk about the quadrupole or the octupole in the cosmic microwave background, because that's far more complex than the simple idea that space respiration occurs at one point in the universe, and space is coming out of that one point. And so, my feeling is it must relate because, of everything that we now know about the space levels and location of paradise and the rest of it. But, that's more than I can say at this point about the octupole or the quadrupole. However, this was like a new thing I picked up on for years. I've been saying paradise is located there, but it never I didn't make the leap that, well, why are finding the distances to these galaxies in the superuniverse space level depends upon this assumption that the sun is moving at 370 kilometers per second in that direction, which I'm now saying is towards paradise. Well, the sun's not moving in that direction, it's stationary. I'm proposing this is my explanation. I'm proposing it's stationary relative to paradise, and that it's the motion of space from paradise past the sun that makes it look like the sun is moving at that velocity, when in fact, space is moving past the stationary sun at that velocity. It gets a little technical, but the point is that, there is, I believe, I made a fairly persuasive argument. I believe there's evidence of the actual the direction of space respiration coming from paradise, which would be the first, I guess you could say, almost direct evidence of the existence of paradise based on what's in the Revelation.
This is it's a brand new concept, and it's one that I wanted to at least start the discussion because it's fascinating, and I think it's a real point toward the fact that there is evidence to show that this 1935 cosmology about a static universe is actually correct, and it's also right mathematically.
Yeah.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, who else? I think David Newford's got his hand up, and then Jeff Taylor. So let's go in that order. David?
Your previous paper for the 22 symposium about, I think it was the new model of the universe, has some changes, I think, from that one to this one. So you can maybe speak about that. And the other question was about the new telescope, the James Webb Telescope's estimate of distances to galaxies. And some of them are like 10 billion light years, 12 billion, whatever it is that they're saying it is. But that would involve multiple respirations of paradise. I mean, from the distance to paradise. So how does that affect light when it's coming at us and then it's retreating and then coming at us again multiple times through this respiration from these distant galaxies? That's it.
Yeah. Well, to answer your last question first, the uniform velocity of 370 kilometers per second, if in fact that is the velocity of space respiration, which is what I am proposing, if that is the velocity, that's only about 1% of the speed of light. So it's not easy to measure that speed by measuring redshift. So, James Webb Space Telescope is looking at things that are 15, have redshifts of 15, which means under the Big Bang theory, that galaxies at that redshift must be traveling at 15 times the velocity of light. So if you're talking about, compare that to 370 kilometers per second, it's like that's almost insignificant. In fact, I'm not even sure you could measure it. As for changes between the paper I gave 3 years ago and today, the cosmic microwave background dipole is something new that I've added to this, but I don't think I've changed other things in the paper unless you can point something up to me.
Well, one of the problems I think is the distance to Andromeda, which I think you've kept to keep the superuniverse level within the local group. There might be discussion about the 400,000 light year semi-quiet zone, where instead of, like you mentioned, that gravity will slow time, that this buffer the light has to travel through it, and it's traveling with accelerated time. So the concept that they give is not saying that there's a specific distance that they're saying, but that light takes a little bit less than 1 million years to go from Andromeda to us. Now, I've been really looking into a study by David Wiltshire called the Timescape model, and they estimate the time that light travels in voids that might influence why the Urantia Book put it that way. So that's one of the things that if the super universe level was actually 500,000 light years wide. With this void situation, the distance would not be a problem with what they said in the Urantia book. Wiltshire says that time is faster by 38% in this void. And when you add it up, the measurements that are given for Andromeda use 3 different methods to determine it. That's why everybody's so sure that 2.5 million is the number. But if you have this void where light is traveling different, it will affect the theory about why they're saying it's 2.5 million. So in other words, what you're saying is totally in line with what I believe too, that these walls are the kernels for the outer universes, but that beyond the zone of avoidance between us and paradise, there is a different way of estimating that there would be another core that we can't see that might be affecting how we're perceiving the arms of the galaxy and things, and the bubble, the Fermi bubbles, that they might not be where they're saying they are 30,000 light years from us, but they might be back farther because we can't really know what's beyond that zone of avoidance.
I've tried to limit my speculation to the available evidence. I mean, obviously, I'm basing everything on the Urantia book, but to the extent that I'm trying to coordinate it with science, I'm trying to coordinate it with clearly identifiable evidence, hence the name of the paper, title of the paper, the evidence for this cosmology. And I'd have to look at the paper you're referencing about the timescape cosmology, which I've thought a little bit about, but I guess I don't feel comfortable going into theorizing about something I'm not familiar with.
Right. Well, I do like your approach where you have revealed cosmology, revealed evidence, and you have observational science where you have data about light, and you have theory about why they say it's this distance or that distance. So there's the 3 possible ways of perceiving the information.
I do want to ask a couple of questions that are somewhat related. Gabriel Rimberg, George, wanted, which I thought was a very, really good question. It's the kind of thing I would like to know too. That if you could pick one current astronomer, astrophysicist, cosmologist to sit down with for 30 minutes and just give them a glimpse of the revelatory cosmology as it is portrayed in the book, of all the ones that you have read, who would you choose to be the one that you would like to speak to the most?
He's a Spanish astrophysicist, Lopez Corredora, who's written a number of papers questioning the validity of the Big Bang theory. But he always qualifies it with, he ends his papers with, I'm not saying the Big Bang is wrong. But he brings up all these objections and he says, now, don't take away my funding. I didn't say it was wrong.
Right. Well, you got to protect your career as a scientist. We all know
Exactly.
that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you can't go too much. You can't swim against the stream too much. Okay.
Yeah.
Jeff had his hand up in a question. I hope we haven't delayed you too long. Jeff, please.
No, it's good. From a more pragmatic standpoint, when the cosmologies or really the astronomies converge, in other words, when we start discovering things that look more like the Urantia book picture that paints, we as a Urantia community need to be ready for that, because I personally feel that that's going to be a huge trigger to interest in the Urantia book from a theological standpoint, but coming from an astronomical confirmation. And there's no way they could have confirmed that. So When do you think that will happen? Is that, hundreds of years out before we're going to have the astronomical tools to align those two astronomies? Or is there some way that we could take the existing astronomical data and do as you have done to manipulate it, to present it in a paper to put out there that would bring that correlation to the forefront? And are we ready as a Urantia community for the onrush that would follow?
Well, I don't believe we're ready. For the whole time I've been studying the book, very few people have taken the science, or in particular the cosmology, seriously, up until just a few years ago. In fact, maybe even right now, people consider the cosmology of the Urantia Book to be a secular scientific cosmology. It absolutely cannot be. If you say paradise, the dwelling place of the universal Father, is at the center of the universe, you cannot then say this is a secular cosmology. That is, by definition, a religious cosmology. So, in response to your initial question, I guess it depends on how many astronomers or scientists are willing to suspend their disbelief of God and entertain the possibility that perhaps God does exist in the universe and that he sent a revelation. These are all very sociologically difficult topics for most people to deal with. They can't, as soon as you say a religious cosmology, everybody thinks of the Middle Ages and the geocentric universe and all the rest of that. And they immediately put their hands up and go like, get away from me. That's magic, myth, voodoo. When in fact, that's where we're headed. If you believe the Urantia Book is a revelation and you believe what they say about the universe is true, then they presented us with a religious cosmology, which certainly has scientific aspects to it, but you cannot disregard the religious aspect. You can't just say, well, disregarding God and disregarding the Most Highs and disregarding the ancients of days, we can look at this as a scientific secular project. I don't know. I don't know if I have answered your question, because I'm not sure I know the answer. I think I've presented a persuasive case that the Urantia Book predicted the existence of two space levels, and they're going to look like this. They're going to be on the same plane. You're part of one, and the other one is 100 times bigger. So I don't know. I find it persuasive, but I'm not sure how persuasive other people find it, this kind of presentation.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. Excellent.
Thank you.
I think Phil's got his hand up. Thank you, Phil. You used his electronic one.
I'm under the impression that Orvonton and the other super universes are really shaped like spokes, not circular. So one question is, how would that, if that were the case, how would that change your distance calculations? Also, space expansion is periodic. So when you say that it's uniform motion, I guess you mean that it's uniform in the sense that it's the same everywhere, but not necessarily the same speed. Because if it's periodic, it would be sinusoidal, right? It would go faster in the mid phase and then start to slow down and reverse. So those two things would be interesting to hear your comments on.
Yeah, as for space respiration, I don't know. It's a matter of interpretation. I made the interpretation when they say a uniform expansion, that is not the expansion that we talk about in the Big Bang when you're talking about accelerating expansion. So if it's not acceleration, it has to be uniform they say it's uniform expansion. So I made the decision to interpret that to mean uniform velocity, which is a clearly defined velocity in physics. You have uniform velocity, or it accelerates and decelerates. So yes, you get a change from an outward expansion to an inward contraction. But the trying to fit it into the evidence, which shows that the center of the superuniverse space level is in the exact direction of the cosmic microwave background dipole. That was my new discovery for this presentation. So we know what the velocity has to be. The uniform velocity has to be. It has to be 370 kilometers per second, which, like I said, is maybe 1% of the velocity of light. So it's almost undetectable as far as redshift is concerned. So that's my answer to that question. As for the interpretation of the superuniverses as either being, I don't know, elongated spoke-like structures, I just in thinking about the description in the book, I could not see how that would be compatible with what they say about Uversa. They say everything in Orvonton revolves around Uversa. Well, so if the superuniverse was a spoke-like structure and it revolved around Uversa, you would still have an extension on either side. In other words, if you rotate a stick, you're still describing a circle. So that to the extent that everything rotates around one location, there's a radius to that location. And the radius I selected was 4 million light years based on all the things I cited in my paper. And the proof is in the pudding. If you make that assumption and then you go through, as I did in section 9, you find that you discover the outlines of the central core of the superuniverse space level, right where it should be, if the radius of Orvonton is 4 million light years. So, the reason is partly theoretical and partly practical. In other words, the proof is in the pudding. Did it work? Would another distance work? Not, I don't think so. But you'd have to try it out.
Okay, Nigel's got a question, and then we'll go to Bob again. So,
Look, George, congratulations, an excellent paper. And given your model for the outer space levels, then gravitational time dilation is an excellent explanation for these cosmological redshifts. So well done for that. Also, I'm happy to admit that if your model is correct, then my model is very, very wrong. Now, I think every paragraph in your paper would need discussion, but I think the first thing to discuss, the first thing I'd like some clarification on is, I think, perhaps the most significant misunderstanding. Remember in 12.4.15, the authors talk about the second outer universe of galaxies, and how the second outer universe of galaxies revolves counterclockwise about paradise. Now, in 31.10.19, which you quote twice in the paper, they mention those 70,000 enormous aggregations of matter, but they say that they're aggregations of matter in the universes of outer space. Now, what you've done, well, as I understand those two paragraphs, those 70,000 enormous aggregations of matter, quote, in the universes of outer space, would include all the galaxies in that, quote, second outer universe of galaxies. But in your paper and in your model, you've included those 70,000 huge aggregations of matter in your first outer space level. In other words, what you appear to have done is include the Urantia Book's second outer space level within your model for the first. And this explains your need to have a 100-fold scale factor between the outer space levels. Now, I think that's wildly different to the radius. Well, that gives you this 920 million light years to the central core of your first outer space level. So we're talking your model assumes that the central core of your first outer space level is at a radius of almost 1 billion years, at 920 million light years, the central core. But this is so wildly different to the radius suggested in paper 12.1.14. In 12.1.14, they appear to suggest a radius for the first outer space level, which is enormously smaller than what you're proposing. If you recall from 12.1.14, they're talking about the first outer space level, a zone of an unbelievable energy action, which increases in volume and intensity for over 25 million light years. Now, your billion light years for the same structure is so wildly different to what seems to be suggested in the Urantia book that I think everything else that you build upon that misunderstanding then, skews the rest of your model. So I just literally everything you said I need to discuss, but I think given the time, that's really all I want to know. How do you address those two, the Urantia book's idea of 25 million light years, increase that sort of V-shaped volume around paradise at the first outer space level, 25 million light years. How do you square that with your 1 billion and almost 2 billion for the outer edge of the first outer space level?
Yeah, the 25 billion million that you're referring to says that the action increases for 25 million, and you've made the same assumption that Bill Sadler Jr. made, which was, well, therefore it must decrease for 25 million. They don't say that. So, I addressed this question in a note you sent me last week, and I gave you the reasons why. So in my humble opinion, the first outer space level extends all the way out to 1.8 billion light years.
All right, just one last comment before I leave this topic. That business of the 70,000 aggregations that you've included in your first outer space level, you've made a huge jump in your logic because they're saying that I haven't actually got, I've got the quote here, just one
It
sec.
says 70,000 aggregations, each of which is larger than any one of the 7 super universes.
That's right, yeah.
So
that
the total mass in the first outer space level is 10,000 times greater than the mass in the super universe space level, if you just do the math. So
now
that's one of the reasons, amongst others. The reason for the 100-fold increase in scale is because they say there's a half million wide light quiet zone between the superuniverse space level and the first outer space level, and there's a 50 million light year wide quiet zone between the first outer space level and the second outer space level. So that's a scale factor of 100.
the quote says that it is increasingly the belief of all Uversa that the assembling core of the finality are destined to some future service in the universes of outer space, where we already are able to identify the clustering of at least 70,000 aggregations of matter. So they're referring to not the first outer space level, they say the universes of outer space. So that's all I needed to say. I'd like you to reflect on the jump you've made from that paragraph to assuming that all of those 70,000 aggregations are actually in that rather tiny first outer space level, which extends, in as I'll show on Friday or tomorrow,
Hmm.
the first outer space level. I'm not assuming Sadler. I'm thinking Sadler was quite wrong. I'm not going a gentle 25 million light years and then fading away. I'm actually stopping the first outer space level where the V sort of rotates. You'll see this tomorrow night. Thanks,
Right.
George.
Okay,
Fine.
thanks,
Yeah.
thanks, Nigel. Bob had his hand up next. Bob?
I'm not that far out. I'm back to Orvonton here, and the 4 million light year radius, observation or revelation. And I think what I detect out of this, George, is that you've been able to match them both using what at 1531 the Melchizedek says the vast Milky Way starry system represents the central nucleus of Orvonton. So just the fact that they brought up the Milky Way in 1935, 36, prior to the final indicting in 42 or 43 or whenever, certainly long before the publication, says that you got to use that. I mean, if we're going to actually do that. So I took the time to validate the math, at least on the local group in the super universe of Orvonton. And in your paper, it's figure 10. And it's basic trigonometry. You've got a right triangle, and you tell us that we can calculate ourselves that the distance from Orvonton to Paradise is 9.2 million light years. Fairly straightforward. And you use that from the current observation, and you went through some pretty good experience here about the past history of how Hubble started and where it's gone from there. And you say that the numbers have changed. So I do have a question in here. So, to me, the math works. And then if you extend that out to the super universe, I think, if I have this right, that the radius of the super universe itself is 27.6 million light years. Is that correct?
Well, that's just if we're 9.2 million light years from Paradise and we're in the middle of the super universe space level, then it's 9 plus 18 is 27. But the actual radius of the super universe space level is 18.4 million light years.
Right.
0.4, 0.2, we may be being too specific or too exact. But, call it 9 or 18 million light years and 27 million light years. That should put us pretty close to what is out there.
Okay, Jeff has his hand up.
Yeah, quick question. The orientation that you have, how does it relate to Sagittarius? Does your 168-degree align Sagittarius? And if it's rotating, how does that not continuously point to Paradise? Or, how does it relate? How can you relate this to Sagittarius for me?
It's not directly related to Sagittarius. Sagittarius is more or less towards the center of the Milky Way. But if you look at star charts, the direction of the Milky Way, 168 degrees equatorial by -7 latitude, that puts you more or less in the constellation of Leo, the lower portion of the constellation of Leo. So, I mean, you could actually plot it on a star chart, and there's nothing there, but there shouldn't be anything there because, you've got you got a billion perfect worlds and no galaxies, no stars. In fact, it's all hidden by the dark gravity bodies. So, so it's basically in the lower part of the area that is defined in star charts as belonging to the constellation Leo.
Okay, thanks. Now Phil's going to get the last question here.
Okay.
All right, I'll try to be brief. I seem to remember that the Urantia book says that the distance from Uversa to Urantia is on the order of a couple of 100,000 light years. and that also we are on the outer edge of Orvonton. And I guess I'm going back to Spoke because I think that, there could be an orbit around Ursa that's, mostly elliptical, rather high eccentricity around Ursa. So they also say that things get, more compact as they get closer to paradise. There's more overlapping of orbits and then on the way out. So if we're on the outer edge and Ursa's 200,000 light years, it seems, I guess I'm with Nigel. I'm having a hard time with the numbers that seem to be like 10 times as large.
Yeah, that's an issue. In fact, in all of the efforts of everyone over the last few decades to try to figure out what Orvonton is, that's been the primary issue. It's like they say all these things about, there are other galaxies in Orvonton, but then they say something like that. And how many galaxies can you fit into 200,000 light years? We're on the edge. So the way I've resolved it in my own thinking is that Orvonton is divided into two portions. And I got this essentially from thinking about paper 15 is written by the universal sensor who can sense will. So the only thing, in my opinion, the universal sensor is interested in is people. So I don't think there are any people outside of or personalities outside of the Milky Way at this point in time. But they tell us, we're a young super universe and things are still developing. So, is that a good answer? I don't know. It's the answer I came up with. And like I keep saying, I'm going back to the proof is in the pudding. If you say the radius is 4 million light years and the distance to paradise is 9, and the size, you can predict the size of the superuniverse space level central core. And if you do an analysis of the actual data, you can see the central core there. So I'm relying on empirical facts to back up my theoretical ideas.